Hey, Cami. Mark, thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Data is the New Black, a Decade in Technology Trends. I'm Julie Armstrong, Chief Commercial Officer at ChartIQ, and with me today is Mark Etherington, Chief Technology Officer of Crux. Welcome, Mark. Great.
Thanks very much, Julie.
Okay, great. Since starting my career in financial technology in 2002, data has been a centerpiece of the industry, but demand for it continues to rise alongside the need for better technology to support it. When I actually started my career as an account manager at a small company called Realtic, we were using fax machines to get permission from exchanges for data subscriptions on an EMS. Hard drives were used to ship historical data orders to customers that took weeks and weeks. And everyone basically just started hearing the word cloud for the first time being referenced to. But 18 years later, we have a very different landscape. So today, we're here to take you on a journey on the history of technology tools supporting the market data industry, leading us into modern day tech trends and maybe a little glimpse into the future. So I just want to do a very brief mention that we will be taking questions after the presentation, so feel free to put them into the chat channel, and thank you very much. So before we dive into the history, I thought maybe we should start at how much does the market data industry cost to participants today? And so just a few quick stats. Global spending on financial market data and news jumped about 5% to a record $32 billion in late 2019. This is comprised of real-time trading and data spending, and it accounted for the largest share of total revenues, with a strong demand for pricing, reference, valuation data, and this is just a quick reference from a Burton Taylor consulting report. Market data spend in the Americas was 48.2% of the global total, with EMEA and Asia accounting for about 33.2% and 18.6% of the total, respectively. But this stat does not cover the broader picture of technology spend overall to support data, staffing, et cetera, but it's a start to share the sheer size, of the marketplace. Oops. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. Okay. So going back a bit in time, I was shocked on how far the data repository for global markets goes. Commodities dating back to 385 BC, rice in China back to 1000, exchange rates in the early 1800s. The NYSE actually started in 1792, and while it is arguably the most powerful stock exchange in the world, it was not the first exchange to actually exert influence on the markets and produce data. In the 1300s, Venetian moneylenders began to sell debt issues to other lenders and to individual investors. In the 1500s, Belgium's exchange dealt in promissory notes and bonds. In 1828, the Chicago Board of Trade was formed as the first grain exchange, and then NASDAQ wasn't formed until 1971 to trade securities, but that did create a bit of competition for the New York Stock Exchange. So just thought that was some fun facts. So while the exchanges greatly benefit from the market data revenues, data does come from a multitude of sources, such as alternative data. This data can stem from satellite imagery of corn crops or any crop for that matter, above ground oil tanker storage to help supply additional data points for commodity traders in corn crops or energy products. There's economic data, there's private equity data, and more. So this dynamic of data sources creates the need for data normalization, mass amounts of data storage, data deciphering and dissemination, and this is where the real investment in technology comes into play. And with 32 billion investment in spending, consumers need to make sure they basically get the most out of it. Okay, so taking us back in time, from 1870 to 1993, the financial markets looked at data points and passed data around through paper, actually, large screens, handheld devices, and then over to screens eventually. But I thought this was kind of a cool photo. Ticker tape was the earliest electronic means of communication, transmitting stock prices over telegraph lines, and it was used from 1870 through 1970. It consisted of a paper strip, actually, that ran through a machine called a stock ticker. It printed company name, alphabetic symbols were followed by the numeric stock transaction, price, volume information was on there. The paper tape became obsolete in the 60s as TVs and computers were increasingly used to transmit data. But the concept of stock ticker lives on, however, through the scrolling electronic ticker seen on brokerage walls. So this picture here, you see features the New York Stock Exchange trading floor in September of 1963, before the actual introduction of the electronic readout and the screens. And then here you see the open outcry pit at the Chicago Board of Trade in '93, where the electronic tickers earn 4 floors. But, you know, why do I bring this up? Because from ticker tape through the floor activity here, it was 123 years to move that innovation along. And so since we're here to talk a little bit about data trends and the history of it, these bits of the story I think are very relevant to our foray into the financial marketplace. So jumping much farther ahead of the ticker tape times and over to a more modern concept called big data. So the rise of big data over the last decade plus has really impacted the industry overall. But I think mostly it's impacted cloud adoption rates, artificial intelligence. Just to give you a sheer essence of the numbers, global big data market is forecasted to grow to 103 billion US in 2027, or by 2027, excuse me. So what is big data? I'm sure we all have heard the term 100 times now, if not more, but big data is a term that refers to the kind of data sets that are too large or complex for traditional data processing applications. It's basically defined as having high volume, high velocity, or high variety. Fast growing mobile data traffic, cloud computing traffic, as well as rapid deployment of tech, such as AI and the Internet of Things, all contribute to increasing volume and the complexity of data sets. So the trends tick on well past ticker tape. Big data analytics, so advanced analytics and tools such as data visualization, which is key to my heart, predictive analytics, data mining, help to extract value from the data and generate new business insights. And so, you know, the global big data business and analytics market is expected to grow, will expect to grow 274 billion US dollars in just a couple of years. And as of early 2019, 45%, I think I have 45% of professionals in the market research industry reported using data, big data and analytics as a resource method, excuse me. So big numbers we're talking about in the billions as, you know, data is evolving, the technology trends around it are evolving. So let's talk a little bit about technology trends and a bit of the adoption life cycle. So no matter how far I think we go back in history, the tech adoption life cycle has looked relatively the same. I think first you have your early innovators, in some cases the founders, the early adopters, those willing to go first, the early majority, as you can see here, those who are usually not afraid to take risks and are willing to invest time and money. The late majority, those who need it proven before they take the time, and then there's, of course, the laggards, and they benefit the last in the cycle and usually require education and help in adoption. So, you know, we've started off by talking a bit about the cost of data, and we probably haven't even touched the iceberg. We've talked a little bit about the history of market data, how absolutely far back it goes. some of the distribution mechanisms to do that, and then starting trends kind of in modern day. But what I'd love to do now is hand it over to my friend Mark, who can help educate us on the operational side of this billion-dollar business. And then we'll talk a little bit about modern desktop from there. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Judy. Can everybody hear me? Judy, can you wave? Make sure you can hear me. Fantastic. I think, fantastic. Okay, so looking through the history is interesting, but let's take a quick peek at actually data itself. So what you're going to see in the chart in front of you is actually effectively the classic projection of what's been going on with data. So it's a standard report from the IDC, but looking at the humongous growth in data that we've actually seen over time. Now, the interesting thing about this is not that the data's grown. The data's bound to grow. If you look at the way that the markets have moved, if you look at the technology sets as well, I think the distressing piece of this is the amount of effectively replication of data, so the duplication of data that actually comes through. And also the fact that the ability to manage this is really where the consequence of this picture goes, to be honest. So if you look at this, I'm making sure I can click. Okay. What we're seeing is a couple of big trends here. So typically what's happened is you've had a consumer industry where the consumers may well be the banks or the hedge funds, the fund managers, actually taking data from a classic set of effectively the exchanges that Julie mentioned earlier, or the big data players in the marketplace, the Refinitivs, the Bloombergs of the world, the ICEs, the IDCs, and so forth. Yeah. What's happening now is that the power of data is not only being detected for effectively the consumers and the providers, but as businesses move to data-driven, it's not just the consumption of data that's become interesting, it's been the production of data. So people that have been consuming data today have also become producers of that data. That whole movement to data-driven businesses has actually linked the two sides of the equation together. And that's put a lot of stress on the system, but it hasn't actually removed the necessity in the way we currently do things to grow and store and duplicate data consistently. Now, this is an issue. Effectively, the efficiency surrounding data ingestion and delivery, which is why Crux exists, at least partially, what the problems we're trying to address, is that you end up in a position where you're duplicating many things. It's not just the duplication of the data. The processes, the operations, the validations, the clarifications that are required to actually use the data. Julie mentioned a very large number in terms of the market. There's another stat which is actually more scary, in that 80% of the data spent on, well, say 80% of the money spent on big data is actually wasted in some respect because it's actually duplicated and it's used to prepare the data before you can actually even use it to gain insights to drive your business. That 80% is where we're trying to actually help. Now, cloud technology has come up a couple of times already. Cloud technology is both an enabler, but it's also the drug for storage. So you're able to actually store a huge amount of data. Cloud technology is basically rapidly expanding. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's the services that come on top of the cloud data that is absolutely critical, because we need to be in a position where you can be able to actually share data. You need to be able to minimize the materialization of that data in the long term. You need to be able to share the operational burdens if we're to sustain the growth that's going on. The sunburst on here is just highlighting that the distribution channels have started to slightly change. There's new ways of actually doing things. But on that basis, let's take a look at the past, because what's interesting, trying to click. My apologies. Here we go. Let's see if this works. Here we go. Right, okay. So if you look at the value of what's happened, I'm not going to go quite far as back as Judy, but we did have a small smile when I also had BC times that come on. The interesting thing as you look at this graph is not necessarily what's new, but the fact that nothing has disappeared. So if you look at physical media, I mean, I know, frankly, I've had my own kids tell me they don't know what a CD is, but they know what a DVD is. But did people know that actually Amazon actually will deliver to you a Snowball, which is a huge storage device to take petabytes and terabytes of data and load it into the cloud from your site. That's physical media. If you go up the stack, FTP, I mean, I wouldn't need to work for if you got to be able to get $1 for everybody that uses FTP in the world. That is the most prevalent protocol that I've ever seen. Forget HTTP. FTP for data ingestion is absolutely everywhere. Email. Companies make an extremely good living out of distributing market data, economic insights, understanding what's going on in the marketplace as newsletters, as postings, ability to deliver data is, email is still a big part of that. It sounds weird, but it wasn't really until until you started to see data being used much more in the mid to late 90s for using APIs to get data from the big providers. You ended up with things like RMDS, Bloomberg feeds, you now have Electron. These are all proprietary style of APIs. And with the SaaS movement, you ended up having an ability to actually access either your own corporate's data using an API. ODBC was where it basically came into existence frankly, only 30 years ago. And these things don't become common until much later in their life cycle. Cloud storage, go back and look at your history. It's probably only less than 20 years, honestly, that we've actually even understood the word cloud other than rain. And now you've got the cloud warehouses that are sitting on top of this as well. So, moral of the green part of the story is nothing seems to die. It does transform occasionally, but the multitude of different ways in, a lot of it actually appeals to the way you want to consume data. You choose the poison that hurts the least, in essence, because you have to get the data. It's not the act of getting the data that's important, it's the data itself. What you're trying to do is minimize the pain of getting the data. If you go up to the cloud evolution piece of this, just in sympathy, for those of you old enough to remember, there were actually cloud services before. They were called bureau services. That then morphed in terms of terminology into software as a service around in the 90s. And it wasn't until you saw the early 2000s that you saw, effectively the Salesforces of the world come into existence, where you actually saw genuine applications and services. Data itself exploded in the cloud from about 2007 onwards. And honestly, I think it's actually a lightweight amount of data. If you're relatively speaking, look at the timelines involved here. 15 years of cloud data is only scratched the services at the top of the surface. The services themselves that are being applied on will drag more and more data into the cloud. It's the ability to apply analytics to the data that will become more important as we go through this. So basic evolution. Let's take a quick peek. Now, this is an eye chart, and we will be distributing the picture to everybody afterwards. But if you take a look at this, there's a couple of things just to bear in mind as you try to get hold of data. Data sounds very easy, but it doesn't start with data. It typically starts with a contract. Consumers and suppliers, there's an exchange of value. That somebody has worked to actually get the data, or there's intrinsically some value in the analysis that's been driven the creation of the data in the first place. So you have to form a contract. And much as there's a standard joke that my best friend is, much as many of my best friends are lawyers, you're in a situation where lawyers aren't necessarily quick. And even though you may want data, you still have to go through a different legal contract with every provider that you want to deal with. That's before you even try to do connectivity. Now, the fact that FTP has been around forever does not allow you to skip the fact that you've got organizations, miscommunications, the setup of actually connectivity between players can be fraught. It shouldn't be, but it is. So you've got the challenges of your legalities with the providers to start with and the contracts. Once you're over that, you then actually have to go apply the connectivity. And at that stage, you can start to do something interesting with the data. But the row across the bottom shows the challenges with this. And these aren't insurmountable. If you're just dealing with a single provider or a couple of providers, you can probably handle all of this. But if you then scale to where your business is going, which are tens, if not hundreds, of different feed suppliers that you need to actually interact with, it becomes extremely problematic. Because some people say there are no standards in the industry. I tongue-in-cheek would suggest that everybody has their own standards. So there are plenty of standards, they're just not yours. So you're in a situation where any time you go to a new supplier, the fact that it says FTP doesn't help you particularly, helps you on the technology. a little bit, but really what you have to do is understand exactly how has that client actually encoded, or that provider encoded their data. Honestly, if I could have a dollar for every time that we've stripped out a comma in a column heading name or a double quotes out of a column heading name, I probably wouldn't need to be working. We're in a situation where you believe actually their focus has been on the origination of the data, not necessarily the structure or the consumption of the data. Getting it into a form where you can even just load it into a database, where you can reliably parse the column names, and you can do that over time as things change, is actually a task. It's not necessarily a huge task when you're doing small things, but when you actually start multiplying this across multiple providers, all will have their own different standards, their own way of representing things, and frankly, their own veracity in terms of delivering the data, their own quality checks in terms of delivering data, the problem starts to actually become problematic. Formats change. And this is before we even start thinking about schema changes. The world would be easy if it was static. It might be boring, but it would be easy to code to. The problem is that schemas change, the way data is represented, the quality of the data. We've had many, many instances where you'll find that a given field may have changed meaning, and that may not have been announced. Units may change. Everybody has their own horror stories in this space. But when a unit yesterday was in the tens and today it's in the decimals, what do? How do you spot it? Yesterday, the data, there was 10 rows of data. Today, there are 10,000. Is that a problem? Is it not? It's certainly an anomaly. Do you detect it? What happens if they add a field? Now, there's two cases here. Typically, what happens in many cases is your code stops working. So then that gives you the opportunity to get those wonderful technicians out of bed in the middle of the night to try and actually fix up both the infrastructure and all the applications to do the loading of it. At worst, these changes are silent. Just like you have a silent change with a field change in unitization, you can also be in situations with some of the XML feeds where you're in a position where you don't know that an extra feed's added because the supplier's not told you and you haven't noticed because your code's resilient enough to get through that. These are just some of the problems that you encounter during the data ingestion process. And once you've ingested it, how long are you going to keep it? Now, safety says keep it forever. But that's an expensive process for you as well. But you can't necessarily rely on folks to keep it because you need your own copy. And that's what's driving that replication. I used to run storage at a major bank. And there was an adage there that used to drive the senior execs mad, which is basically the data is typically written once, read never. Now, that's not usually the case. People generally do read data. But the ability to actually read how many times does a data item that was like 10 years old actually read? Are you actually managing archival storage? And if you are, why are you managing that versus everybody else in the industry doing this? So you actually have an operations chain, you have a operations cost, you have a infrastructure cost, you have a development cost. And all of these are inefficiencies in the market. Utilities, and clouds may be part of that in terms of servicing the utilities, are necessary because the inefficiency is huge. And bit by bit, the ability to actually share data, share clean data, to share operational overheads, to actually manage data is an inevitability because economically, this doesn't make sense. You're trying to get insight out of data. Now, this is where visualization, and Julia will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but the visualization piece of this is a way of getting insight. Your applications regression tests are a way of getting insight. It's all about insight. If the cost of obtaining the data to provide the insight is a material portion of the value, you need to optimize the cost piece of this in order to get data in the easiest way. You don't want to be keeping a staff, I would suggest, that knows all the nuances of the 25 key suppliers that you have that all do things in a slightly different way. You don't really want to keep oodles, that's a technical term, up there with megabytes of data around just to keep a history in case you can't access it. You need repositories, you need to be able to share, and you need to, more importantly, to be able to provide your intellectual capital, your services on top of data that you can trust in order to actually generate insight and benefits for your business. Every single column of the challenges along the bottom is an opportunity for something to cost you more, for something to actually damage your business, or indeed to be in a situation where you have to run fairly large staffs, which has, again, economic impact, in order to maintain a semblance of normality for your data chain. We view this very much as a data supply chain, and we all need to play our part in it, and we believe there's efficiencies to be made in the middle. Okay, and let's try again. Okay, so last one for me. Just take a look at the economies at a high level. And we've used an analogy here of the data grid or the electric grid. Now, lots of different types of styles of plugs in terms of the sockets over on the right-hand side. So that's a good analogy in terms of the amount of data feeds we need to do, and lots of different ways of getting power. So whether it comes from vendors or whether it comes from clearing houses or exchanges, we're using the power system as an example. What we're trying to do with Crux is be in the middle to remove the friction of different standards, different ways of communicating, different ways of receiving data. And I'm not completely focused on the data consumer. Data consumer is a hugely important part of the ecosystem, but so do the data suppliers. For every data consumer that doesn't want to deal with multiple different data suppliers, nuances for connecting, I have a data supplier bemoaning consumers that want to receive it in different ways as well. We try to act as a multiplexer of this to actually bring value to the data chain, to bring value to actually getting data from the providers to the consumers and back again the other way. And we provide an ability to plug into the middle of this, the ability to add services on top, their own custom validations. That ability, whether it's us or others, to provide a utility built upon my rotating clouds, which effectively allow us to share data, fully entitled to share data in the cloud, I think is a long-term trend that we'll see. You still don't get away from the fact that data needs to be cleaned to get into the cloud. Being in the cloud alone is not sufficient, and having clean data is not sufficient to gain insight. With that, I'll turn it back to Julie.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. So, in kind of taking us to the close of the webinar, we didn't spend a lot of time on Mark and my profiles, if you will, or career histories, but I just kind of wanted to note that I've been in fintech for about 18 years now, and my entire career has been around data and software. And so coming over to ChartIQ and being able to engage in data visualization tools and desktop interoperability, which I'm going to talk about just for a brief moment, has been really kind of combining the two things that I love the most. So Mark, thanks so much for your data points and kind of getting us to the final phase of data management here. And so I think we have to think of the desktop and how data consumers visualize all the data in front of them, and then what tools they're going to use to either read or tell the story depending on the kind of participant they are. So on the left-hand side, you can see it was just kind of fun as I went through my, the history lessons. You kind of learn the most from, history, and into the modern day. But, to the left here, the earliest seeds of visualization arose in geometric diagrams and basically tables of positioning stars and celestial bodies. And then in the graphic you see on the left, it's a representation of a time series chart in 1821 showing prices and wages around ruling monarchs for a 250-year period. So as I kind of look back at when was the first data viz, and learned it was mainly around, as I said, the celestial bodies, and then dating back to as far as the 1800s and probably before. It's just part of the source I found. To find a time series chart on something was pretty delightful. So today, the modern chart tells a story through its ability to manage complex data sets through elaborate graphics. That's one of the things that we do here at ChartIQ. We distribute charts for pre-trade, trading, and post-trade capabilities. We do cater to the same participants that Mark mentioned, the buy side and sell side, to help them make trading decisions. The vendor community broadly to support their execution and order management applications, just to name a few. And just representatively, I wanted to just show a chart here is from our post-trade visualization toolkit. And it's representative, the toolkit is representative of firms trying to spend time merging proprietary data sets such as chats, OMS data, phone logs, et cetera, and third-party market data to help see everything in one place. So there was other charts that actually, historically looked somewhat similar, and then there's, the modern day, version to telling the data story. So I just thought that was a cool thing to bring forward in today's history lesson. But charting is only one application of many needed, and through all of the history we've heard today, more and more demands are being made on the modern desktop. And at ChartIQ, we offer a product called Finsample, which is our smart desktop application that I believe is part of a software revolution, and a new trend that is creating a new dimension, and I think most excitingly, a new category of software in fintech. In the last several years, the momentum of HTML5 has resulted in technological overhaul within the cap market space, and therefore, firms are shifting from a lot of their legacy applications built in Java and .NET and C++ and HTML5. Financial companies are kind of racing to not only offer competitive and beautiful interfaces, but immersive ones. And so, just as we move from, the beginning of time, as far as we've recapped it, we need, to start managing data. At ChartIQ, we build software to help, humans navigate these changes over technology exploration. We are the early innovators. I believe that our co-founders, we engage the market of early adopters, and we've sought to help shape the next wave of technology, which is driving efficiency in the marketplace. I think our tech allows data to be successfully managed across a multitude of applications, and our data viz tools are helping analysis and decision making. And I think it's, just as a glimpse into the future, as I said, the smart desktop is a new category, and it's one that is getting a lot of attention right now, and it's a brand new space. So I hope that you've enjoyed our history to modern day journey around the data industry. I absolutely cannot wait to see how these trends further develop, what new ones pop up based on new demands, and most excitingly, how the data business can drive more opportunities for all. So with that, I want to thank absolutely everyone for their time. We are going to open it up for questions, and if we don't get to your question, we will have your email information, and we'll get back to you. But thank you very much. And here's information to contact Mark or I should you have additional follow-up. So thanks everybody for their time. Mark, would you like to say anything in closing?
Yeah, I mean, as just switch to a little bit of the Q&A as we go through it, is the only thing that's consistent in data and the ability to actually get data to the endpoint is the inconsistencies. That sounds a bit cute, but the world is very complex. The ability to try and simplify this is hard. So, I would urge everyone to look at industry solutions, whether that's use Finsample or the Finos type of approaches that are out there to try and get standards into existence, or use the utilities. Try to support the utilities where possible to actually get an easier experience for all of us. Financial data it's very difficult. Financial data is all data in many cases. I think there's a question that's just come up about lessons on COVID. Everybody was rushing around, frankly, for data on COVID. Was that for health? Is that for finance, skill gain? Is that for trading? It's very interesting that context has become a very important thing. We did a interesting conversation with the Google GDELT guys a few months ago, and the context of like an empty beach, was that good or bad? Well, in COVID, that's good, because it meant that social distancing, that quarantine was working. In economic terms, it's bad because it probably means that tourism's down. Now, both are true. So I think context, whether it's COVID or whether it's social unrest, context is so important. You need context in order to assess data, and you need to question data. You need to understand data. So our job in terms of Crux is to make sure the data is available and clean enough to actually be used and be useful. What we're seeing, obviously, with our friends at ChartIQ is the ability to try and interpret that quickly to determine actually trends, insights, directions. So it's very, very important. So COVID is in is very, very impactful, but it's no different than many other aspects of data or trends that occur at any given stage. The ability to react and to ingest also points you at standardized interfaces to data and standardized ways of gathering meaning from the data, with my point on that one.
Mark, do you mind if I jump in on that one too, and I'll hand it back over?
Sure, go for it.
Cool. I think that was from my friend Chuck. So hey, Chuck. I know we can't really have a dialogue here, but it's good to see you on here. I want to say that lessons from COVID. First off, anecdotally, I'll start off by saying that I've been speaking for a long time on the financial circuit, and this is tough to not draw from the energy of people, right? Mark and I can see each other, but I hate not being able to see our audience or participants. So want to just thank everybody again for taking the time to engage us this way, so to speak, and hopefully we're reaching out to stay connected with everybody. To Mark's point on COVID and lessons being learned, I mean, we actually have some use cases right now around Finsemble. A big thing in Finsemble is context sharing, right, across applications. So that's very prevalent in our DNA and our software capabilities. But one of the things, I don't know if I'd call it a lesson much as it is, you hate to kind of say, well, I found opportunity in COVID in a capitalistic way, but you want to say I found, we're pleased to say that we've found potential solutions to help our friends out in the industry who are trying to work from home in conditions that they're not used to working in, managing multitude of applications from either a small laptop or one tiny monitor. Finsemble has started to see some use cases, helping engage users, through our desktop solutions. And so, because being able to not have 20 screens in front of you per se, and needing to link and channel across a multitude of applications and context share has become quite relevant in today's landscape. So just kind of another, I think hopefully there'll be somebody that does a history lesson, in this point in time, we'll be on it, and maybe our technology has made a mark as a result. So anyway, just wanted to kind of share that use case has come out of it for us.
So there's an interesting adjunct to this, which is somebody's asked a question here about how do you set yourself apart from homegrown solutions and why is it important? So great question. I mean, the thing you should focus on perhaps of this, and I'll look at it from two different perspectives here. So if you look at data ingestion, I completely agree. A single supplier, very easy types of data set. Why wouldn't you do it yourself? There's not a huge amount of infrastructure to do. The problem is scale, and the question is focus. So if you link this back to we'll link the two topics together with COVID. If you look at what actually happened with COVID, we had people running to us going, "Have you got a COVID data set? Have you got a COVID data set? What do you mean? What do you want?" Now, there were people in the industry, and there are companies out there that try to recommend the best data sets that you could use and how you use in a given scenario, but they're not knee-jerk reactions. They're usually considered pieces of analysis to work through on this. The fact that you're asked, or the community is asking desperately for, give me COVID data, doesn't actually know what it wants. Now, some of that goes to the homegrown solution thing, because at a point in time, companies that you're doing things that other companies and other utilities can do better. Now, why do you move? Well, economic and focus. Even in major organizations, you find that there's a natural evolution. You'll find like a business department will start doing its technology itself, and then there'll be multiple departments doing that. So they need a common group to do it. And the common group then starts doing common things, but there's actually the market starts doing it. So you see the general evolution time and time again across the market, which is both economic and focus driven. And that focus driven thing, I think, has become very apparent here, because when we talk to many professionals, they're not sure what they want. And why aren't they sure? Well, in a lot of times, because they're spending too much time doing the plumbing, and I don't mind being called a plumber in this case, but they're spending too much time doing the plumbing of getting to data, too much time manipulating that data into their own form, because we all have our own form that we need to get it to integrate into our systems. When the reality is, I would suggest that instead of spending 10 or 20% of your time focusing on the data, you should be spending 80% of your time focusing on the data and maybe 10 or 20% on the plumbing. The ratios are completely inverted. And you actually see this with the desktop as well. I've been dealing with ChartIQ and the Ensemble guys for a very long time. Would you really, I mean, there's an overlap here with Electron Desktop and OpenFin. Would you really, do you honestly think it's good to go and build your own desktop container these days? Again, it's a focus conversation. There's little to differentiate on the technology. There's a lot to differentiate on the scale. There's a huge amount to differentiate on focus. So focus, you don't focus as a business, you don't get the maximum value you can get out of that business. So my short answer, or my long answer to the homegrown solution is, they're fantastic until you need to scale. They're fantastic until you need to focus.
I couldn't have said it better myself, so I'll leave that one there, including a plug for us. So thanks, Mark. Do we have any other questions? I'll give it another couple seconds. I don't want to leave folks on here idly. All right, there's one for you, Mark. What is Crux doing to clean the data?
So I happen to know who just submitted that. So thanks very much, Eugene. So I think the question should be phrased, what are you specifically doing for me to clean the data that I want? So no, in the situations we have, so we work on it on two different levels. A lot of firms actually want the data, I would say, basically cleaned. Yeah. So they want the outside wrapping cleaned off before they get it, but they don't actually want deep cleaning of form, because they believe, and quite rightly, it's their opinion, that the raw data is actually what they want to see, with minimal processing in order to shape it to be loaded. So we pass that straight through. We also allow effectively a wider range of manipulation. Now, validations are a subclass of cleaning data. Data cleanliness itself is a tricky topic to define. Everybody has a different view about it, and context comes into this again. But what we're trying to do is provide a platform where if a specific client wishes to validate data in a different way, then we will support that. We can code that into automatic triggers effectively in our platform to tidy it up. We also believe there are standard things that everybody wants. Yeah, and these they range from what looks simplistic, like, please could you make sure that all of the headers of my data are uppercase, all the way through to, I don't need you to join some of the most sophisticated data sets in the industry, and this is my clue about how to do this. We want you to do something and take two data sets that I'm entitled to and work out what a third data set would be on my behalf that you could process for me. So we've got a structure to do it in terms of the validations. We've got a structure to transform as well. And we have an approach that is quite clean from a definitional perspective, what we view as validations or anomaly detection all the way through. I will say that the core point about this is that we allow the consumer to decide whether the data is valid, or the consumer to decide on the quality point that they're accepting as they do that. We're not judging. We're trying to be as neutral as we can and as useful as we can to the industry on both the providers and the consumers.
That's great. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, I'll go ahead and let Cami wrap us up. I really hope everyone stays safe and well during these times, and I cannot wait to get back out on the road and in person with most of you. I want to thank my cohort, Mark, for joining me today. It's been really nice to work with him and his team to put this little history lesson and kind of the current state of affairs in data management, which is, I think, near and dear to our hearts. So I'll hand it over to Cami to just send you guys off, but have a wonderful day and stay well.
Hi, I'd like to thank Julie and Mark for taking the time to present today. And also thank you all for attending today's webinar. If you gave us your contact information, you'll be receiving an email with a link to the webinar's recording soon. I know that we had a few people that had audio issues, so you'll be receiving a recording, so no need to worry about it. Thank you again, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.